you on joining us. And we have LaDonna that'll give us a couple of our housekeeping rules. But looks like everybody has been here at least once or twice, so you've already fallen into line by adding your name and city. But LaDonna, is there any other housekeeping things that we need to discuss before we get going?
I think if you can rename yourself to include your city, that would be great for us to give you your credits. Also, if anyone has a question throughout the presentation, if you want to put it just in the chat box, that way we can keep track of them if she's in the middle of presenting. That would be great. Other than that, I think we're good. Eleanor, you can take it away.
Great, thank you. So again, I want to say welcome. Welcome to our third webinar in the Equity and Inclusion series. Again, as I had mentioned before, Christy is now our friend, no stranger to KLC and our city officials. She presented last year in our Rollout Equity and Inclusion series, also on disabilities. And so today's webinar, as we all know, is assuring that our events are accessible for all. And with our little conference, big conference coming up next month, I think we can also get some tips from that and to use. So I will do a brief introduction and then I'll roll it over to Christy and she'll take it away. So Christy Stambaugh graduated from San Diego State University with a bachelor's degree in recreation administration with a therapeutic emphasis. She earned her master's degree from the University of Kentucky, go Cats, in rehabilitation counseling. She holds national certifications in both therapeutic recreation and rehabilitation counseling. She has worked with senior adults and people of all ages with disabilities for the past 31 years, which Christy, I can't even believe it's been that long. She don't even look. I mean, shout out, seriously. She has experience in working with individuals of all ages and abilities. Currently, she works for the Lexington Department of Social Services. She is the Director of Aging and Disability Services. She also oversees the operations of the Lexington Senior Center, the various satellite centers, and community at large. Lexington itself, the city of Lexington, joined the network of age-friendly communities in 2014 and became a dementia-friendly community in 2020. So without any further conversation or ado, I'd like to introduce my friend, Ms. Christy Stambaugh, and she will talk with us today about how to make your event accessible. Thank you.
Thanks, Eleanor.
You're welcome.
I'm so glad to be here today. And as I was saying to Eleanor at the beginning of this, I have been in this for 31 years. I started when I was 3. It's actually probably been longer than that. But in the course of putting together this presentation, I learned some things, and I'm really excited to share them with you all. So we'll get started. I hope you can see my slides. Let's see. Having trouble advancing them. There we go. So did you know, and think about yourself and your life, because I think many of us have experienced temporary disability throughout the course of our lives. So if you've ever broken a limb, a leg, or a foot, a hand, you have had to alter the way that you conduct yourself both in business and in your leisure life. So people with disabilities are the only minority group that you can join at any time. Let me let that sink in for a minute. And again, think of a time when you may have had to use crutches or a knee scooter, or maybe you had your eyes dilated and you couldn't see as well as you typically do. Here are some statistics for the state of Kentucky. And as you all know, as we try to gather statistics, it's hard to get like to the minute. But this statistic, the second one here, 33% or 1 in 3 people in Kentucky have a disability. That number has stayed pretty static for the 30-some years that I've been doing presentations such as this. So it's really not that small of a population for us to be considering things that we do to include all people in all that we do. So the Americans with Disabilities Act affects all of us because we're city people. We are public entities. We are receiving all kinds of different revenue sources. And so we must abide by Section 2 of the Americans with Disabilities Act, all of them. And you can read this, but no qualified individual with a disability shall, by reason of disability, be excluded from participating in or denied the benefits of the services, programs, or activities of a public entity, or be subjected to discrimination by such public entity. And really what it requires is that we provide meaningful access to programs and services and a reasonable accommodation. And we'll talk more about some of the things that are meaningful and reasonable. And one of the things that's been really tricky with the Americans with Disabilities Act is that there's not huge oversight. And so it's left to many of us to do the right thing. And oftentimes we're not sure what meaningful access means. And hopefully through the course of today's conversation, I can help clarify some of that. And then we'll talk also about some reasonable accommodations. But I just saw like a screenshot on Facebook that said the ADA is the floor and not the ceiling. And so in the course of what I do for the city of Lexington, I am looking at the very bare minimum, the requirements of the ADA. And the ADA was written and passed in 1990. And as many of you can attest, so much has changed with technology, the size of people, the size of adaptive equipment. For instance, here at the Lexington Senior Center, a couple of our users use bariatric chairs. That means their wheelbase is 36 inches wheel to wheel. So for them to go through a 36-inch door, they have to reach around, grab the door jamb, and pull themselves through because there's not enough room for their knuckles. So when we were designing our building, we designed with 42-inch doorways. One, so that persons could be side by side and very conversational, moving from room to room in our facility. Or if a person needed somebody to guide them, they could do that. Or a person who had a large chair. The chairperson for our Access Lexington Commission, which is our commission for people with disabilities in Lexington, he happens to be a person who's a quadriplegic, and he is 6'5". So he is a very, very tall man in a very tall wheelchair that has a huge battery pack in order to help him to ambulate. So there are some things that the Americans with Disabilities Act, it's a good guidance, but really we need to think beyond that, more to universal design. So I got off tangent already, which is not unlike for me. Okay, so inclusion, because this is something Eleanor is really working on, is diversity, inclusion, and equity within all of our entities. And so inclusion is a process of changing attitudes and beliefs, and oftentimes this is one of the biggies of creating an environment that values and promotes full participation, and that requires time, commitment, and leadership. But really, a lot of it is intuitive. And again, oftentimes I bonk myself on the head and say, why didn't I think of that? And so it's being intentional in the things that we do. Inclusion's also building bridges to other opportunities, making adaptations to benefit the greater good. Before the meeting, we were kind of talking that whatever we do for the population who has the most difficulty ambulating through our environments benefits everyone. So with our age-friendly communities, we kind of have said what's good for a mom pushing a stroller is also good for a person who uses a walker or a wheelchair. So if we really normalize changing the environment for all kinds of mobility, then we're going to be serving the greatest number of people. And then we need to be sensitive to the needs and limitations and really looking towards the strength of all people and our programs. So then, you know, you can't do one of these presentations without defining what things are. And so oftentimes we use the terms handicap and disability interchangeably. And did you know that what we used to call handicap parking is now accessible parking? Because a handicap is something that makes it difficult for you to do. So if you think of the word handicap, it's really those stairs that are in this image. That is the handicap for the person who's using this chair. So then a disability is really the condition of the person that limits some activity of daily living. I'm going to let you think about that for a minute, because quite honestly, I kind of go back and forth. The language used to be handicap parking, a person with a handicap person. And really, it's the environment that becomes the handicap. So then, of course, you look through the World Health Organization and their definition of barriers, because through this presentation, what we want to do is remove barriers. We want to make it easier for our people who are coming to any of our activities, events, meetings, conferences, presentations. We want them to have the best access or the lack of barriers. So it's factors in a person's environment that through their absence or presence limit functioning and create disability. These aspects include the physical environment that's not accessible. If you think about how many times you may have gone to a restaurant. So I'll give you an example. I was on a knee scooter for a while after having a mass removed from an ankle. And I went to a movie theater. And I, could drive and all of that, and got out of my vehicle and got my scooter out of my car. And then there was a curb all around the front of this particular movie theater from the parking lot up to where you enter. And there was a curb cut. And there was one curb cut in this great expanse of curb. And a police vehicle from the community was parked right in front of the ramp. And so luckily, I still had balance and coordination and was able to hop up the curb on one foot and then lift my scooter up behind me. So I thought, this is a problem for me, but it's probably more of a problem for somebody else who, like our chair of our commission, who uses a motorized wheelchair. Motorized wheelchairs are really heavy and they don't pop curbs or do a wheelie very easily. And so I'm thinking, how would Jason have gotten to this movie? But so I go through the movie and it was a great movie, whatever. And they were very accommodating and you could get accessible seating at the movie theater. And I was able to prop up my leg through the entirety of the show. And that was great. And then I come out and that police vehicle is still parked in front of the ramp. So I go home and I write an email and say, hey, I'm sure that the officers know this, but just in case, perhaps if they're not responding to an emergency, perhaps they might choose to park their vehicle not blocking the access ramp. And they responded very quickly and they were like, oh, we're so sorry, we know better, blah, 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 blah. Now, I was thinking, when I first encountered that, the lights weren't on and the police officer wasn't around, but I thought surely he's conducting some kind of business. And he or she probably was conducting some kind of business, but it wasn't emergent such that they needed to block that access ramp for some reason. So that's one example of the physical environment not being accessible. This was something that could have easily become accessible. Now, a bunch of people on our commission are persons who use wheelchairs, and they regularly express concern of barriers that exist throughout our community. So we are currently working with some of the local grocery vendors who in the spring very smartly bring a lot of indoor product outside onto the sidewalk in front of their stores. Well, in doing so, it blocks access on the sidewalk adjacent to the front of their stores, such that persons who use mobility devices then are forced into the line of traffic in front of the stores. So we are identifying furniture that gets put out on the sidewalk. So be thinking about things like this. Like you're setting up a outside display, you're doing a festival out on your city streets, just be sure that there's enough room to maneuver around safely so that you're not forcing pedestrians into the line of traffic. Lack of relevant assistive technology also creates a barrier. And one of the things that COVID really brought to light for the population that I work with, my seniors, is that everybody put everything onto the web, or you can order food by doing this and you can do this. But a lot of people still don't have assistive technology, at least seniors in my community. Probably about 50% of the more than 3,000 seniors we serve in a month have access to technology that they're comfortable with. So that statistic is still out there. Now, the community of persons living with disabilities really are relying on assistive technology heavily to open up doors for them, to make it easier for them to navigate in this environment. And so it's kind of a double-edged sword with the populations that I'm serving. Seniors are a little bit behind the curve in general, and persons with disabilities have been using assistive technology forever and 3 days. Then other barriers are negative attitudes towards people with disabilities. Of course, I want to believe that's just because they've not been exposed to people with disabilities, and so they don't know, we're all kind of people. And then services and systems policies that don't really exist, things that we may be able to affect to improve the quality of life for our people with disabilities. Okay, so now we'll kind of get into the meat of this. So as I was thinking of this, I was thinking of all of the presentation or all of the special events and things. Summer's a big time, moving into the fall for all of the communities, for people as they're trying to gather people together. So I kind of started in the parking lot. And as you look at where you are choosing, and oftentimes we have a choice of where we're going to provide an event or activity, but sometimes we don't. And so what we need to do is really look at how can we minimize any barriers, or how can we maximize the space that we have. So an area that is level in the parking is really, really important. So in the course of my job, I have to go to one of the big box stores. And in Lexington, one of our big box stores has a huge slope in their parking lot. And now I'm not talking about mobility, but I'm talking about convenience, right? So I have a loaded down flatbed cart with all kinds of things on it. And the cart starts rolling away because the parking lot is a slope. Now, you can't always change that, but as you're building and redesigning new things, you can think about level parking surfaces. When we opened up here at the Lexington Senior Center and we had our groundbreaking, we knew that a bunch of our users were going to come and celebrate with us. Well, it was a big open field. And so we had to construct with plywood a ramping area to get people from the curb up to where the big tent was, where the big ceremony was going to be, where we were going to be cutting the ribbon. So be thinking about who is coming to your events and understanding that sometimes nothing is there but a big grassy field. And the day we did our groundbreaking, it was pouring down the rain. But we had, I can't even remember. We tried to configure the place, not in the middle of the 4 acres that we were going to be cutting ground, but a little bit closer to where we had the ramps to get the folks in that used mobility devices. I did an event at what used to be the Lexington Convention Center, or whatever we used to call it. And it was an event for people with disabilities. And so I talked to the facility organizers and I said, hey, is there any way we could convert those parking meters out front to all accessible parking spots? And they said, what a great idea, let's do it. And so they bought temporary bags that went over the parking meters that were the universal sign for accessible parking, much like this image on this slide. And so those things exist, that you can make additional temporary accessible parking based on who might be coming to your event or activity. So here at the Lexington Senior Center, we opened the door with 16 accessible parking spots. We have 137 parking spots, which never was going to be enough to begin with. And 16 of them were accessible. Quickly upon moving in, we knew that that wasn't enough accessible parking for us. And so we did a little study of our parking area and found the most level area with the least slope and added some additional accessible parking spots. Now, quite honestly, in our parking lot, I could have half of it be accessible parking spaces for placard holders, but there's close enough parking that I didn't feel like I needed to do that. So you kind of got to use, again, the ADA is the floor, not the ceiling. Think about who you're serving and what's going to be most important. When we were at the old center, I regularly went out into the parking lot and counted how many accessible placards were in people's windows, or how many license plates with the universal symbol was there. And that helped to drive how many additional beyond the ADA accessible parking spots we were going to need. Hey, this drop-off location thing for public transit riders or people being dropped off is kind of a big deal. We have seen, unfortunately, some new construction in our community and the private side that it doesn't lend itself to public transit riders. So in bigger communities, and many of you are from there, I can see from where you're located, you have public transit. So then you have paratransit, which is in Lexington Wheels, but also the required door-to-door service for people with disabilities. And so what they do and what they're mandated to do is to drop off and provide door-to-door service for their riders. So if there's not a place for public transit to pull up to a facility or a venue or a field or wherever it is that you're doing your event, it becomes a problem for the riders. Now, it doesn't have to be right at the front door, but it should be in a location that's equidistant to the more ambulatory visitors. So you kind of don't want to put the accessible entrance in the very back corridor of the farthest way around from any of the amenities, but it doesn't have to be the front door. And so that's kind of, I can't think of what that word was. Anyway, well-marked barrier-free entrances. So I think push button door access is really, really important. And in the absence of that, a person who's greeting people who might hold the doors open for others is a reasonable accommodation to help get your visitors in the door, have a greeter, have somebody there. It's ideal if the seating is in close proximity to whatever the entrance is that's accessible, because you may have some slow movers who are using walkers or crutches or wheelchair or walkers or crutches or canes, and that walking from the parking lot to the facility expends all of their energy and they need to have some seating pretty close. So then I was thinking of outdoor venues and venues that we have been to in the Lexington community when we do Shakespeare in the Park and when we have concerts in the park and things like that. Ideally, the entrance would be at the most level place so that a person wouldn't have to climb up or go down a hill, but instead maybe they could have the seating available in the least or in the most level area with variety of seating options throughout. And so and companion seating. I remember a million years ago going to an event at Rep Arena with a group of individuals with disabilities, and we all kind of had to sit in the same place. And so then it was like, oh, look at that crowd of people. I wonder what their deal is. When in fact, some of our folks would have loved to be able to sit with their best friends. So the people with the wheelchairs all kind of had to clump into one area where 4 wheelchairs could sit. And then their best friend who was ambulatory or didn't use a wheelchair had to sit somewhere else. So ideally, we put together a variety of types of seating so that companions can be together. It's not a bad idea to have ushers or helpers at any venue to help with any kind of seating, because people get confused and they may not see where the seating is. They may not understand where they should be going or where they can access the seat. Shade or options for shade is always something to be thinking about, or to advertise that you might bring an umbrella because there is no shade, because we get hotter as depending on our disability or the weather. Seating along a pathway, this is a great thing to bring community together, is that anytime you have a pathway, a walkway, if you could put benches or portable seating along the way, there are just people who like to people watch. And so this serves that kind of purpose as well. But also when a person gets tired or exhausted, it's nice to have a place to rest. Restrooms, like portable restrooms, have accessible wheelchair accessible ones. So they have a ramp up to them. They're much larger. If you can only afford or plan to get 2 porta potties or whatever they're called, you might be sure to make sure that one of them is accessible. Again, this is great for a mom who's got a toddler, and you're not going to send the toddler into a porta potty by yourself. And so if you have one that's slightly larger with grab bars, then a mom with toddler or toddlers could use that accessible restroom too, or porta potty. Hand washing stations that are accessible, and most of the companies, at least that we deal with around in the Lexington community, have those that are accessible, that have a place where you could wheel under them so you could actually get to them to wash your hands. And then directional signs throughout, which doesn't really have anything to do with accessibility unless you have designated entrances, exits, or you only have accessible restrooms in one area, for instance, then you'd want to have directional signs to let people know where that is. All right, now we're moving into indoor venues. Does anybody have any comments about outdoor venues or something that you might have experienced that you want to share for the good of the group?
Christy, I was just thinking as you were talking about the outdoor and the ramp, I know so many times that when you discuss this, people think, oh, that's going to cost so much money to make these changes that would make it more accessible to people. Can you kind of speak to that, the cost effectiveness of these things? I mean, how difficult, how expensive was it to have that ramp kind of brought in as an addition?
Sure, we did it with plywood. Now, back in 2014, plywood was far less expensive than it is today, but we used 3/4 inch plywood, and our maintenance folks tacked on 2x4s when the ramp turned. Other than that, it was just planks of plywood. And I think that probably, I don't know that they went out to buy many new materials. I think that they had these on hand. You could rent commercial ones, and of course, commercial ones are going to be more expensive. But really, in the way that I think is, I really didn't want anybody with high heels or fancy shoes slipping and slopping through the mud on the day of our ribbon cutting. So while it was purposely constructed for our mobility issues, it served every single person who came to our event in a meaningful way. So I think I certainly looked at it as the cost of doing business. And to provide, you were talking about risk management earlier. The safer we make an environment for all people, the better we are as we plan our events. I hope that helped, Eleanor.
Absolutely. Thank you.
And really, when you're doing construction, if what we've found through research, and now this is for private homes, that if you choose to use universal design principles and have doorways that are 36 inches clear, it costs exactly $100 more than had you used 32-inch doors. Now, I'm telling you, my mother is 93 and she lives in a manufactured home up in Michigan, and her doorways are 27 inches wide. She fell and broke her hip not long ago. She used a walker. The walker didn't fit through any of the doorways on the interior of her house. So I'm like, oh, Mom, it'll be all right. We'll take the doors off the hinges. We'll take the framing out of the door. And she's like, Chris, why don't I just turn my walker and walk through sideways? I'm like, oh, problem solving, blah, blah, blah. Let's just do this. And she, again, had cognition enough to figure out how she could adapt. But it's a shame that she had to, and that her home, while it's in a neighborhood all designed for people 55 and older, it's not really accessible in that way. And we'll talk about doorway widths in a bit, probably. Okay, we'll move to indoor venues because I don't see any chats in there. So we again talked about convenient door drop-off. For people who are dropping off loved ones, for people who use paratransit, ensure that the facility has a barrier-free entry and safety egress. So this is something I learned. We have a lot of exterior doors in our building here. Our front door and all of our front parking lot. And if you've not come to the Lexington Senior Center, I certainly invite you to come check it out. We built in 2016. We average about 330 to 350 people a day, 1,200 different people a month, and about 800 people, different people each week. So we have a lot of comings and goings. In our parking lot, we don't have any curbs along and about where our accessible parking is. So when a person gets out of their vehicle, whether they're a slow mover using a walker or a cane, or they're using a wheelchair, they don't have to drive in the traffic lane in search of the ramp to get onto the sidewalk. So our parking lot was really intentional in that we wanted people to be able to exit their vehicles, get out of the traffic lane, and then get right onto the sidewalk. So it's wonderful and it's beautiful. Well, so we have a lot of exterior doors. The swing of the door, interestingly, is really important to be able to safely evacuate a building during an emergency. And so I'll tattle on us, and we've already got a corrective action in place. But along our classrooms on the west side of our building, there's a 3.5 foot wide sidewalk. And when the door opens, there's exactly 1 foot left of that sidewalk for a person to get around. So we're extending the sidewalk on the west side of the building. And the city of Lexington smartly created a new ordinance for all new construction in residential areas, I think business areas too, that sidewalks need to be at least 5 feet wide and oftentimes preferably 6 feet wide. And we think about that as you open up a 36 or 40-inch door, how much space do you have to get around the door, especially if you're a person who uses a walker or a wheelchair or can't get into the grass or wouldn't be safe to ambulate through a non-smooth surface. So that was one of the things that by putting together this presentation, I came to realize I don't have enough clearance on the exterior side of one of the buildings because we shorted ourselves on sidewalk. So be thinking about that, be thinking about how you would safely get out of the building. When we designed this building, we started design in 2012, 2013, and I think the first mass school shooting was around that time. We weren't thinking about active shooter. We weren't thinking about the protection of our folks inside the building. And so we needed to quickly adapt the space and make sure that the doors could be locked from the inside, and also that there were places that a person could get out of vision. So some of those things came into light way past when we started designing this facility. So look at the restrooms that are accessible. Our restrooms have automatic door opening. And so we had to find some way to stop the automatic door opening should there be an active shooter. And so, of course, technology exists that there's a place to turn off the function, and there's a system that you can put into the floor that locks the door so that it can't be opened from the outside, so that we can use our restrooms as a safety place in the unlikely event, hopefully unlikely, I'm knocking on all kinds of wood, that an active shooter should infiltrate our facility. So we love that we can wave and our doors open, and that's a great accessible feature. But then you also have to plan for the what if. And that was something we hadn't anticipated either. In our restrooms, our accessible stall is the very first one you come to. How many times have we walked into a bank of restrooms and the accessible stall is at the furthest end? And so intentionally, we put the accessible one as the first stall that a person gets to. We also made all of our stalls wider and installed grab bars. We also installed, and I would recommend every locality to consider these as you put in public restrooms. It has a full hinge on the hinge side of the door so that we can safely lift the door and open the door should a person be stuck or need assistance without having to contact the maintenance person to get the screwdriver, to get the whatever it takes to get the door off the hinge. And so those full length hinges are a lifesaver for us. Then when we were designing this facility, and I have to talk faster, believe it or not, we were looking at variety of seating types. So we did a survey of our people. Do you want arms on your chairs? Do you not want arms on your chairs? It was split right down the middle. Half of our chairs have arms and the other half do not have arms. We also ordered bariatric seating that the seat itself is 30 inches wide. So it looks like a teeny tiny love seat, or for a person who might need a bariatric chair, we have those presents. And then again, we talked about seating along any lines, wide aisles between tables. One of the things we also do often is try to cram as many people into a venue as we possibly can. And I'm talking we globally. And so we need to be really considerate of who our users are going to be. And are we going to have a lot of people potentially who use walkers or wheelchairs and need more space to move around tables and displays? And I'm thinking of when we do awards banquets, things like that. All right, and then this one, if you have a counter or a sign-in, here at the Lexington Senior Center, we have a high counter, and then we have a cutout with a lower counter for our people who might not be very tall, or who might use a wheelchair, or can't stand for a long time and need to interface with us from a seated position. And so variety and level of desk or check-in, then, you know, tables or whatever. If you're doing a buffet, have some helpers available who can carry the plates for persons who are unsteady on their feet or might use a wheelchair and need to navigate on their own. Now, straws are coming into conversation in many of our communities because of the environment, and for the community of people with disabilities, especially those who have high-level paralysis, straws are a lifesaver because they can't tip the glass to drink, but they may be able to tip their head forward to use a straw. So if you can, have straws and or beverage lids available. Again, convenient door drop off. I've seen that like 5 times on my presentation. I must really think that's important, and I hope you do too. Quality sound amplification, even if you don't think you need it, because we don't know who is in audience. We sometimes think that we have a loud booming voice. We think that our audience is young and can hear everything. Hearing loss happens at all ages. And so if amplification is available, we should always use it. We had an enhanced listening device installed in our facility, and it's FM and AF audio, I don't know what that stands for, but it works with our sound system. So if a person has a hearing aid that has Bluetooth capabilities, when we are using our amplification, our microphones in our classrooms or our multi-purpose room, a person can activate an app on their phone if they have it and get the signal directly to their listening device or their hearing aid, and it cancels out all of the extraneous noise. If a person's technology doesn't already have that, or they don't have Bluetooth, or they don't have a smartphone, this particular device that we purchased has a receiver that then communicates. So a person could come to us and say, hey, I'm really having a hard time hearing. We talk to them, and then we give them a personal receiver to wear around their neck or set on the table, and it will give them the signal directly. So they're in an earphone so that they're hearing and canceling out all the others. The most common system that's out there, that's been out there for a long time, is the looping system. And there's some vendors in Kentucky that install this, and they can install it temporarily. And there's resources at the end of my presentation regarding this. But we did a conference here together with the Kentucky Commission for the Deaf and Hard of Hearing, and we had about 120 attendees. And we installed this loop technology, which is basically a safe zone, if you will. And it's a wiring system that hooked to our sound system. So anybody that was sitting inside the loop got the signal directly to their cell phone, and it canceled out all of the extraneous noise. That, if you're doing new construction, is probably more affordable. But because we were doing post-construction, we did the enhanced listening devices here at the Lexington Senior Center. All right, consider closed captioning. We could do that on this webinar, and you could be reading the words that I'm saying through the magic of AI, or you could hire a person who would then do all of your closed captioning when you're doing a presentation, a press conference, when you're doing your city meetings, when you are doing an event. So when we did our event with the Kentucky Commission for Deaf and Hard of Hearing, we had both the CART system, we had sign language interpreters, because not every person who is deaf can read, and not every person who is deaf uses sign language. And so we had the looping system, we had CART system, and we had sign language interpreters so that we could meet the greatest need of our people. Again, another resource in the end of this presentation is where you can find a list of sign language interpreters. I think at the very minimum, a community should have sign language interpreters and or closed captioning when there are press conferences related to emergencies. I would love it to be there always, but I think specifically when there's a state of emergency or a weather emergency or active shooter or some other kind of event, it's really important to include all forms of communication to our populace. When you're doing lighting, strobing, I used to work when Parks and Recreation, we ran our Trail of Terror. There was one of the stations on the haunted trail that had a strobe light, and at least 2 of the times that I was working, a person had a seizure at that station, and so we needed to run and render aid. So it's just best, even though it's very cool to have strobe lighting is known to often trigger seizure activity in persons prone to that. Print material that's not glossy. I started when I was 3 and been at this some time, but a glossy magazine is really hard to read sometimes. And so while glossy printed material looks so fantastic and it's a little bit more expensive, you might choose matte because it's easier for more people to read. And then have agendas and schedules available online or electronically prior to an event. I was doing this low vision, no vision symposium a bunch of years ago with the Bluegrass Council of the Blind, and I happened to be the chair of the planning committee, and I also happened to be the only person who could see. And so conducting the meeting and having meaningful materials to share with everybody, like the agenda and the minutes from the last meeting and the timeline. If I sent it to my committee ahead of time through their screen reading technology, they were able to follow along or at least know what I was going to be talking about in the meeting. And so that was a great learning experience for me. All right, we're talking about print material. So the ADA has guidance for print material and requirements. One of the things that I have tried to do every time I do an event that requires pre-registration is put this question: do you require an accommodation in order to fully participate in this program? And it's really, do you require an accommodation due to a disability in order to fully participate in this program? If so, please describe. So that disability could be needing sign language, needing wheelchair access, but the disability, the not disability part could be language access. I need a Spanish language interpreter or Swahili or whatever other languages might be spoken in your community. And then dietary preferences, because we have so many more people. Every time I do a food event, I have a number of people who need and may need, because of disability, gluten-free diet or prefer vegetarian or non-dairy, things like that. So that question is one of the things you can always put in your printed thing. And you can put due to a disability in parentheses if you want to capture language access and dietary preference. All right, then these are the fonts that the ADA recommends, and these are based on screen readers for persons who have low vision. So again, I've worked with a community of people who are blind for a long time, and it fascinates me. I have a guy who I interviewed when he was very young, and he works at a pizza place, and in one of his ears is the customer placing their pizza order. In his other ear is a signal from his keyboard what he's typing. So you order a cheese pizza and he's hearing, okay, a cheese pizza for so and such and such and such. And then he's writing cheese pizza for blah, 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 and the phone number, blah, 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 blah. So he's got to use both sides of his brain, one to listen to the new message and one to confirm what he is typing. It is fascinating. And he has been on the job for many, many years. So these screen readers want simplistic. So these are the most approved fonts. And then color contrast. So see how this black is on the white background? That's preferred over white on a dark background. And then the choice of text color is really, really important, but don't use color to communicate meaning, because it's not brought up and interpreted in the screen reader technology. And then I like the biggest the font I can fit on any kind of anything, but try not to print anything with lower than a 12-point font. And then the other thing that I learned when I was doing this is that PowerPoint, when you convert it to a PDF, and then today I was working with Word, there's an accessibility checker. And I didn't know this, and I'm very glad that I discovered it today. And so this accessibility checker, like the document I was looking at had the city's logo with the horse and Lexington. And the accessibility checker asked me to define what that was. So I could say that it was the city's logo with a horse, or I could say it was purely decorational. And then the screen reader will just say a decoration, event advertising, always ask blah, blah, blah. Then beyond that, it also asks you to order or change the order of the way it's being read. So in this particular slide, originally with the accessibility feature, the screen reader was going to be reading font, contrast, color, and size first, and put event advertising, which is my midline header, down at the bottom of the document. So then I went through every slide and reordered the change of it so that if a person was using a screen reader, it would be in a meaningful order for them. I hope that was understandable. As I was saying it, it was a little confusing. Really, I'm not great at technology. Eleanor has a great experience with technology, but not me. And I was able to figure it out. So hopefully it won't be that complicated for others. Here are the resources that I promised you. And these are just websites, but you could just type in Kentucky Commission for Deaf and Hard of Hearing or the Kentucky Council of the Blind. Oops. Anybody have questions?
Christy, the accessibility checker you just mentioned, is that something in Word or PowerPoint or?
It's definitely in Word. And then when I did PowerPoint, it was when I converted it to a PDF. But I really didn't test it. I didn't see it in just PowerPoint, but when I converted to PDF, it did. And it was smack there hitting me in the face this morning when I opened up a Word document.
Thank you. That's really great to know.
Hey, is anybody from Lawrenceburg on? I heard you guys were doing some fantastic things with accessibility in your eventing and things.
I don't really see any of them, but we do have several of our loss control guys, and I think one of them, maybe Aaron, mentioned some of the things that Lawrenceburg is doing. Let's see, yeah, Aaron's still on. I want to catch you off guard, Aaron, but
No, that's fine. No, I just, they have some outdoor events and the ramps that they have provided to the stage to make that accessible is just some of the things I've noticed when I've been out on some member visits with some folks, and I just mentioned that to Eleanor, and so it's good to see when we're out in these member cities when they have questions, we have some resources we can point them to.
Great.
thank you, Aaron.
We did a conference at a local hotel, and our keynote speaker was a person who used a wheelchair. And so, you know, when you normally have like a conference space and they have a stage or a platform set up for you, we only had to reconfigure a few of our tables so that they could attach a ramp to that staging. And honestly, the cost to add the ramp was negligible. And really, probably I didn't add this, but when you're having a speaker, you might make sure or ensure that they could go up steps. Because if they couldn't, then you might need to add a ramp, like Aaron was saying, like to the stage or to the platform or whatever it is. And because our people are living longer and healthier, I think this is going to be something that we encounter more and more.
Christy, some of the things that I took away from your presentation was basically know your audience in advance. So I like that you had that on your form where they're registering the question of how we can accommodate. And so you said, do you require any accommodations to fully participate in this event due to disabilities? Is that kind of how you phrased that?
Yeah, before I added the language part, I always would say, do you require an accommodation due to disability in order to fully participate in this activity? But now we have so many people who may need language access and who may need interpreters for that. That's not a disability, but still I would like to know, do you need an interpreter in order to do this? So we're getting ready to have a big event here. It's called the I Know Expo, and it's kind of a home and garden show for caregivers and people with disabilities and people as they age. And so in the advertising, it says, do you require any kind of accommodation, so that we can ahead of time. We typically provide a sign language interpreter for a 2 to 4 hour period during the event, and we advertise that to the community of people who are deaf. And then also, if somebody needed a Spanish language interpreter or another language interpreter, we could provide that to them. And we should. And we could. But we can't if we don't know. So it's a little trickier when people don't have to register for an event. And
Sure.
thing that I have certainly experienced is that the community of people with disabilities totally understand that if they need to request maybe a sign language interpreter, they need to give us 24 to 48 hours. And if we didn't know that they were coming, we can pivot and use writing, directions on pieces of paper, things like that. But it's kind of wrong to assume that writing out instructions is the accommodation. The best accommodation, if you know in advance, is to have a sign language interpreter. I have a member of our Access Lexington Commission who's deaf, who reads lips, and she doesn't use American Sign Language, but I have found an interpreter who does the voice so that our participant can read her lips. You may have seen her when you came to our meeting, Eleanor.
Yes, I did.
Yeah.
That's great. And so those services, like how would someone, from the resources that you provided, how would some of our city officials go to these links? I take it?
Yeah, if you go to the links, the Commission for Deaf and Hard of Hearing has a list of statewide certified interpreters based on communities. It's always more affordable if you have an interpreter in your community, then you're not paying for travel time. But there are interpreters located throughout. And then the same for access to language. There's a couple entities, I didn't put them. In Lexington, we have Access Language Solution, and it's a company that provides a variety of language access. The other is Language Line. Probably many communities use that. They also have sign language available, but in the community of Lexington, we use Language Line, such that if a participant, we have a gentleman here at the senior center and he speaks Spanish and he is taking watercolor art classes. And so we provide him with a Spanish language interpreter so that he can get the best experience with his art. We have another participant who speaks Spanish and she's mostly taking exercise classes. And we provided her with an interpreter the first time and she said, I don't need that anymore. Now that I understand kind of the rules of the classes and what to expect, I can just follow along. And so oftentimes it may seem expensive, but it's the right thing to do. And not many people abuse the privilege, if you will.
Sure. That's good. Well, this has been just wonderful and very insightful for me. Again, and I hope for our staff and our city officials that are here. Again, we have our conference coming up next month. And so we hope that some of these tips that you've given us, things that could be easily implemented without a lot of expense, can be brought forward. And again, the thing that stood out most to me, things that are done for the least can benefit the whole, the majority. So definitely, you know, it's just a little bit of intention, a little bit of thought that goes into it, and the benefit could be great for everyone. So again, thank you for being a part of this. I wanted to share with all of our officials on our Zoom today that also, if you have any ideas moving forward for other equity and inclusion webinars and things that you want to see, I have put my information in the chat. Christy had shared. We'll also share this information in her PowerPoint with all of our participants today. And so again, Christy, we just want to say thank you for always sharing and being so insightful. Very informative, Danielle said, and I'm sure there's others that want to chime in on that, but just thank you so much for being a part and continuing the fight since you were 3 years old.
Thank you.
You're wonderful. So with that, I believe that concludes our webinar. Again, thank you everyone for being here and hope to see you soon.